It's the middle of summer, and the fantasy world is fully focused on figuring out which Patriots wide receiver Jacoby Brissett can underthrow all season long. The NFL slappies are out in full force, going over training camp highlights of players in shorts, talking about which coaches are nicest to their players. And while the dweebs are having their fun, we're going to go over to a sport that actually matters. That's hockey. And the best place to play over an Underdog Fantasy, where you can win $25,000 to first place in their season-long best ball contest. One that I've won before. It wasn't $25,000 at the time, so I have a hill to climb. But all that being said, I do think that these 10 players that I'm going to discuss are going to emulate 10 of our biggest risers from last season. Instead of explaining maybe too much as an overview, I'm going to kind of get right into it, explain on the fly. I will mention one stat that I'm going to mention quite frequently. Corsi for per game is one of my favorite stats, and it really just means shot attempts per game. Other than that, let's get right into it with our first player, and that is Mackenzie Weegar. Now, it seems like it was forever ago that Mackenzie Weegar was being drafted at 180.9. That was his average position from draft number 1 to the final draft on the season. This is not a player that was even close to 100% drafted, and a player that I only took five times in my 150 drafts. And those 5 times correlate perfectly to the times he scored 40-plus underdog points in a week. Now, the thing about Mackenzie Weegar and the reason why we weren't drafting him wasn't because he profiled like a player that could score in the system, but rather he didn't seem to have any access to a top power play on a team that really didn't have a lot to consider offensively to begin with. So when you take all of that into account, it wasn't that crazy that we missed on Mackenzie Weegar, who was actually, frankly, very good even before Noah Hanifin was traded and only made bigger afterwards. But how can we look next year to not miss out on that guy? That guy, of course, you can see the graphic here, is Gustav Forsling. Now, Gustav Forsling loses Montour and OEL as competition in Florida. But to be honest, he already was fully cemented in his role as a top 4 defenseman, likely top pairing defenseman in Florida, where he had great rates. Last year, Forsling had 6.2 underdog points per game, and Mackenzie Weegar in 22-23 had 6.2. So not that crazy to think that these are similar entities that can be boosted quite massively by getting a bigger role. The Corsi for per game for a guy in Forsling was 5.01, and he had 27 primary points last year. 14 was the primary points Weegar had in 22-23. So we kind of see that maybe these guys don't do it the exact same way, but certainly Weegar's shots and blocks, both hits really and blocks could be somewhat replicated by Forsling by just getting more run. Getting any access to the top power play would be huge for Forsling, but not necessary. I understand the risk of Adam Boeser, who couldn't crack it in Columbus, taking a little bit of his run. But I think that this is a player that can definitely be at minimum, a solid floor output, and at maximum be a top 10 defenseman in this scoring system. Player number 2 is a guy that I was much higher on in Mike Matheson, a guy that I was absolutely jamming going into last season. Didn't have a lot of risk of losing too much of his role, although Lane Hudson was not going to arrive last year. And at a full, healthy season, Mike Matheson went from defenseman drafted again at 178.8, defenseman 46 drafted, to defenseman 12. A massive, massive, massive uptick in the right direction. And a guy that, again, I said I think we could see this coming. So if I saw it coming last year, who is this going to be this year? And that's Seth Jones. Seth Jones is a player that I know has a little bit more risk of losing that role to a guy like Kevin Korchinski, but we haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen Korchinski take much of, if any, of his role. So I don't know why we would reject that now. Seth Jones was a guy that had, of all of his points last year, almost half of them, or well, actually more than that, 65% of them were primary points. And he just didn't have a lot of any talent around him outside of Connor Bedard. They go out and get Teravainen. They go out and get Tyler Bertuzzi. They add a lot around him, and guys like even Alex Martinez, who can take a little bit more of the defensive workload off his shoulders. I don't think it's going to cut too far into his ice time with still some of these bottom guys being pretty bad. So you take Seth Jones, a guy that has been able to produce points, has been able to produce shots, blocks, hits. You put him around more talent, and that really does remind me quite a bit of Mike Matheson, who never has been a guy that we've considered a top fantasy asset. but has had a lot of good underlying numbers. And when the role comes together, it can click. Now, I don't think Seth Jones is going to get there by having 50 plus assists, but I do think he'll have more blocks, he'll have more hits, and maybe even put up similar shot rates. I mean, again, in 2022, 2023, in the very few games we thought from Mike Matheson, he had 8.1 underdog points per game. Last year, Seth Jones had 7.2 underdog points per game. A pretty decent margin, but I don't think that is because of the player that Seth Jones is as much as the talent around him, especially when you look at the offensive upside. Our third is one that, again, I still almost can't believe that we were just not drafting Sam Reinhart and taking guys like Dylan Cousins before him. But Sam Reinhart at 156.2 last year, center 34 and finishing as the 7th best center in the underdog system. And then, of course, he only had 31 goals. And in 2022, 2023, played with Lundell a good bit more than Barkov. 1.14 times the time on ice was spent with Lundell than Barkov. And last year, almost 4 times his ice time with Barkov comparatively to Lundell at 3.82. That's going to help quite a bit at 5-on-5. Of course, the power plays really saw his massive spike in production. And it'd be incredibly disingenuous of me to suggest that Jake DeBrusk is going to have 50 goals. I don't really think that's in his range of outcomes, but I don't think we're looking for him to be a top 10 at his position type player. We're just trying to find an upside piece at 123.4. And Jake DeBrusk has never had the talent he's going to have around him this year. Jake DeBrusk should be, most people projecting he's going to play with Elias Pettersson. If he plays with JT Miller, that's more than fine. He seems like the perfect fit in that net front power play one position on one of the most lethal power plays in the league. He should be able to find scoring and secondary scoring from that spot. As well as last year, he only played 186 of his 5-on-5 minutes with Pasta comparatively to 436 with Charlie Coyle. He didn't have a lot of access to top talent. And his best run, especially in the playoffs where he actually had some peak weeks, were with Geeky and Pasta. So I think if you put him with even better talent than that, which I do think will exist in Vancouver, the sky is the limit. So I really think that Jake DeBrusk is a guy that, number one, is going too late. And number two, we could look back on and think, how did we not see this coming? I feel that way about Reinhart personally. Now, Reinhart in the wing is definitely a bit different than Reinhart at center, as you know, if any of the previous underdog content we've done would show you that the positions are just different. And of course, Reinhart would have gone much earlier. But how much earlier than 123? I don't know. So yeah, I think this is a great comparable, albeit the upside case of DeBrusk is not quite the upside case of Reinhart. But if you would have told me last year that Reinhart was going to have 50 whatever goals, I kind of would have thought you were crazy. Getting on to our next stay right in Vancouver with our guy that jumped quite a considerable amount in Brock Boeser, drafted as winger 62 and finishing as winger 30. The bet on Boeser was very simple. If he stays fully healthy and is completely ready to go, and that, of course, comes with the caveat of what he openly admitted that was affecting him, and that was the passing of his dad, Duke, which was terrible. And, it took him some time to fully get over and be back on track and have a full offseason. And he admitted going into last year that he was ready. He felt like he was 100% good to go. With that, we saw the best Brock Boeser we've seen, a guy that was just electric, scoring goals over 40 last year and playing in a Vancouver system that really, really suited him well. A guy in Artturi Lehkonen kind of feels like we finally got to see the best version of him in the playoffs. Of course, he did get injured and had an off-season shoulder surgery, which is a bit of a concern. But if he is healthy and we see that same playoff performer that we saw getting 11 points in 11 games in the playoffs with most of his time with Mittelstadt, that could be pretty fun. Artturi Lehkonen's always had a propensity to shoot, maybe not at the same rate as a Brock Boeser, again, until the playoffs, where he did see those kind of levels and those outputs. He did see that power play run, and he was awesome on it. If Valer Nichushkin is gone for good and Landeskog doesn't make it back, which, again, are two things I'm projecting, I think we're going to really be shaking our heads at why we weren't more focused on Artturi Lehkonen, who should be cemented in the top 6 role, should see much better shot volume with Mittelstadt, but more point production potentially if he ends up playing alongside Nathan McKinnon. Both players he should see a lot of run with. He saw about the split really in the playoffs with a little bit more going to Mittelstadt. If the rates come together and the shoulder's fine, I think the sky's the limit for Artturi Lehkonen. And again, I'm not saying he's going to be a top 10 winger in the league, but Boeser took 32 jump spots in the right direction. I absolutely helps you advance out of the beginning rounds. And there's a ton of upside in a player with that kind of role in Colorado. Next, we get to a Joel Eriksson Ek, who went from center 28 up to 11, an all-rates player that can play every single facet of the ice and has major spike week potential with Pro Kaprizov that we saw. But I think that the reason why you're going with a guy like Nico Hischier is because while they might not get there the same way, I think that they absolutely both can get there, and they're much more likely to score in a similar fashion in Best Buck than we're considering right now. Now, of course, last year we didn't quite get there on Joel Eriksson Ek, and we should have been a Travis game earlier. I think the similar case for Nico Hischier right now at 122.4 and seemingly dropping. After Lindy Ruff was fired, Nico Hischier was 49th in the league in points per 60. Timo Meier was even in the 20s himself, playing alongside with Nico Hischier. And I think that that's going to only continue. In the same stretch of games, Joel Eriksson Ek was 182nd in the league. While I think that may have been a bit of a worst or bad output for Joel Eriksson Ek, I think that's pretty par for the course on what we could be looking at in Nico Hischier, who's absolutely shown that type of upside as a number one overall pick in the past. He will have access to Timo Meier, who was just not himself for the first every game until Lindy Ruff got fired, and could be back to full form to start next year. They'll all both get access to Jack Hughes at times at 5-on-5, but definitely on the power play. So yeah, I see quite a bit of potential output, especially from the point side for Nico Hischier, who is on a team that's tied second in the East for cup odds to win the cup. And a lot of people seem to be jumping back on board. If they're going to get there, it's going to be because Nico Hischier was smashing all along the way. And this is a guy that had almost about a 5 Corsi for per game last year with 55% of the shots getting on net. That's pretty good and very similar to how Joel Eriksson Ek gets there as well. A guy that shoots a little bit more, gets 63% of his shots on net. These are guys that I think both have a lot of potential, and I love the fact that Nico Hischier continues to fall into my lap. Finally, we get to the player that I was the highest on last year, my biggest pat on the back, my most drafted player in Filip Forsberg, who I like to say I saw coming. Of course, I did also bet him to win his division in goals, and Nathan MacKinnon decided that wasn't going to happen. But a guy that in 2022, 2023, leading into this peak year, where he went from winger 21 drafted to at 44.3 up to the third best winger in underdog scoring, he had 6.44 Corsi for per game and 0.38 goals per game in his, I think it was 40 or 50 games played. He missed quite a bit of a year in 2022, 2023. If you look over at Jordan Kyrou had 0.37 goals per game and 6.17 Corsi for per game. This is a Blues season that was really quite a roller coaster. They fired Berube in December. Jordan Kyrou made a bit of a comment and was nearly crying at a press conference because the reporters were just bashing him for being negative on Berube. There was a lot wrong, but at the end of the day, this is a Blues team that missed the playoffs as the last team out of the West and would have made it over Washington in the East with 92 points. I know that they don't look like a playoff team on paper, but we don't even need them to be a playoff team. I mean, no one thought Nashville was going to be a playoff team last year, and they made it. Whether Kyrou's in a playoff roster or not, this is a team that I think will be hovering around that 90-point mark again, and it's largely going to come on the back of Buchnevich, Kyrou, and Robert Thomas. Robert Thomas, who I consider to be a much better offensive player than Ryan O'Reilly. The game was going to call me crazy for that. If they are together at 5-on-5 in the power play, this is the guy in Kyrou that could take that 6.5 Corsi for every game, get it up in sevens, and maybe be much closer to a 50 goal scorer. I love this comparison. I think the new coach is going to help capture a little bit more of that upside. And I'm really, really excited to see a full season of Jordan Kyrou and Robert Thomas without all of these distractions. My final two comparisons are going to be dual comparisons. We're going to look at Tippett and Konechny versus Zetterlund and Toffoli. Now, Tippett and Konechny are two that I was very high on. Konechny went from winger 39 drafted up to winger 16, and Tippett went from winger 42 up to 20. Now, they didn't play a ton of run together, but of course, both got there in a similar vein. Now, I'm pretty sure, recorded as saying I thought the Flyers were better than expected, or would be better than expected, and be like 10th worst in the league. It ended up being right there in the playoff mix till the very end. Two of their best rate shooters were who I was betting on. Whether they made the playoffs or not, or were even somewhat competitive or not, I thought their only windows to success were through tipping and connecting, which I was proven to be correct on. This year, at the worst odds to win the cup at 25-1, the San Jose Sharks have pretty big facelift on their way. Their best rate shooter last year with Fabian Zetterlund at 5.21 accuracy for, again, shot attempts per game. And they pick up Tyler Toffoli, who has about 5.5 shot attempts per game. These are two guys that, while aren't on the same level as Tippett and Konechny at all, I do think it's a poor man's version, are going to get access to two of the best up-and-coming play-making centers in Macklin Celebrini, the number 1 overall pick, and Will Smith, 2 years ago's 4th overall pick, who clearly has quite the skill of moving the puck. It may take a little time for that to click. That's okay. If your 7th winger or 6th winger in end up getting there in the playoffs, you're not going to be mad. So I think this is a good bet on the best rate shooters on a team that could be better than expected. But even if they're not even anywhere close to the playoffs, but they just get 80 points or something that no one really expects in San Jose, it's largely going to be because they found goal scoring from the guys that are going to shoot the puck the most, playing alongside of Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith. Our final comparison is one that I would say pretty much most people missed, but I definitely was missing on quite a bit last year. While I did have a decent bit of Vinny Trocheck, I really largely faded Artemi Panarin and was absolutely punished. Sometimes you can fade a guy and think that you were kind of correct, and other times you can fade a guy and you were just wrong. Panarin, the reason he got there more than anything else was Zibanejad and Kreider had lost a bit of their step at 5-on-5, and Lafreniere only helped take already one of the best players in the world in Artemi Panarin, grabbed Vinny Trocheck, who had a career year, and then brought it all along for the ride. They saw a ton of high-danger offensive zone time at 5-on-5, and ended up becoming much bigger catalysts on the power play with, again, a couple other guys dropping off a little bit. Panarin at 5-on-5 throughout the entirety of 2020 through 2023 had about 0.49 primary points per game, and in 2022-2023 had 0.46 primary points per game at 5-on-5. Of course, primary points being your first assists and your goals. Matt Barzal last year had 0.48 5-on-5 primary points per game, and Trocheck was 0.38 primary points per game at 5-on-5 in his 1 year in New York previous to the last, while Horvat was 0.36 primary points per game. The shot rates are somewhat comparable. The point output was somewhat comparable. We saw massive minutes and time on ice going to the top guys in Barzal, Horvat, and Brock Nelson in Long Island. If Brock Nelson falls off even a little bit, we may even see more. And I think some of the wingers that will surround Horvat and Barzal could be better in pickups than Duclair. So I'm really high on this Islanders tandem. I'm really high on Barzal, and I can't wait to see what they can do and bring to the table in our Best Puck Classic. Again, if you like this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all the engagement farming things. Send it around. I'd love to see new people jumping into the space. And whether you're drafting in one league with your home friends, or if you're going to max enter the Best Puck Classic like I am with 150 teams, I do hope this was helpful. If you have any questions about any of the stats, hit me up. I'm always down to share. And from Matt and Doug and myself, have a good Best Puck season, everybody, and we will talk to you soon.